On that note, it is my honor to introduce Tsleil-Waututh Knowledge Keeper, Les George.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. As mentioned, my name is Les George. My father is from Squamish Nation, and my mother is from Tsleil-Waututh. It always fills my heart. I was the Indigenous storyteller for this season, and it really filled my heart sharing my knowledge. And I come from the bloodline of late Chieftain George, and anytime another book comes out, it always fills my heart that we're writing so many more and more books. And I'd just like to welcome everybody on behalf of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And in my teachings and protocols, when we gather like this, our protocols are to share and open with a song. And the song I'd like to share with you guys is Tsleil-Waututh clan song, Takaya. And Takaya in our language means wolf. Oh, see him.
Thank you, Les, for that beautiful song. Like many of you here, I was deeply moved by reading Michelle's first novel, Five Little Indians, and it's really one of the books that I recommend the most to friends and family. And I was thrilled when Patricia Massey approached me and saying she was going to bring Michelle Good to Vancouver and wanted to partner on an event. So before we begin, I want to thank Massey Art Society, Massey Books for their partnership on this event. Thank you so much. And I also want to thank the Talking Stick Festival, who have been invaluable partners as well. Without all of them, this event would really not be possible. So another show of thanks. Now, who is here for the very first time? Okay, great. Welcome. Who's been here in the past 3 months, 4 months? Okay, awesome. Our marketing is working. A little bit. So some housekeeping notes for those of you who've never been here. The bathrooms are located right outside this door to the right. We're not at the ballet. This is not the symphony, so you can come in and out as many times as you want. I'm going to ask you one favor, though. Please use the door at the back because it's less disruptive than the door at the front for the audience and for the speakers here. So that door, please. And take a moment right now to silence your cell phones. You don't have to turn them off. In fact, please keep them on and take pictures and videos and post on all your social media and tell the world you're at a very cool library event. But make sure they're not making any noise. The last housekeeping note I have is that we, as you noticed, have Massey Books selling the books here. And so there's going to be a book signing at the end, and there's going to be probably a very long lineup at the end of the event. So if you want to not have to wait in the lineup, there are pre-signed copies of the book that Michelle was signing right before you all came in the room. So the ink is still very fresh on those. So you can grab one of those copies instead. And now, before we get to tonight's speakers, we also have a surprise performance for you. So Zofia Rose is a Dakel First Nations mixed Polish poet and musician. She's making their home in the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And Zofia Rose is forever chasing the muse and thrives making food, music, and poetry for a living. Welcome.
Jorge, can I bother you for the little stand thing? Of course. Thank you. Howdy, my name is Zofia Rose. I am a Carrier First Nation and Polish, as you just heard. Muy preciado. I have my cheat sheet here because I just finished writing this song last night in honor of this event and the hard conversations that many of us have been having for the first time over the last couple of years. I'm 31 now, but I spent 18 years of my life in foster care. I'm very blessed and grateful to still be here and to have my family once again. But there was many, many years where I did not know where they were or if they knew where I was. And this song was a poem that is a reflection on those thoughts and those feelings at that time. We go where we are told. They lay go in rooms and houses we'll never see again. We go where we are told, play outside with kids we'll only know for a week or two, forgetting their names. Wish we could stay. Wish we could stay. Wish we could stay. We were lent to our foster parents, daughters, husbands, parents, friend, called it a respite. Respite for who? No, not for me. I only had one wish, that was to be with my family. So far away, so far away, so far away, so far away, so far away. We switched schools, we moved towns, we stood on bridges looking over and down at the highway below. We were alone, we were alone, we were alone. And then we aged out, had to figure it out. Yeah, all on our own, had to figure it out. No one to tell us now. We are grown, we still find day to day battles how to stay alive. I found adults who knew more than me, and I let them love me. Yeah, I found adults who knew more than me, and I let them love me. I was the key. I was the key. I was the key. Lucky indeed, indeed, indeed. Hari, Hari. Nachele. So you are my, I showed my mom that song on the phone last night, but you're my first true audience, so thank you very much for witnessing. I have another song here that, it's called Mother's Sake. I wrote it during the coverage of the discovery at Tecumlip Shuekmek. I was working really hard. I had 3 jobs, and I was pretty much just burning myself at both ends because I didn't want to think about it and I didn't want to talk about it because I spent my whole life already thinking and talking about it. And then I had a little bit of a break, a little bit of a vacation. I just sat and rested and house sat some cats and dogs, so got some TLC. And I wrote this song and I immediately felt better. It is on all streaming platforms. It's called Mother's Sake. And it is what it is. You're about to see what it is. Don't cut my hair, just leave it there. Don't stop and stare, pretend to care. Don't take my hand and walk away. For my mother's sake, for my grandmother's sake, for my mother's sake. Don't take that book, you know it took more than one life. My breath belongs to sky, my bones belong to earth. Bury our judgment, not our children. Burn your pity, not our bodies. Douse your hatred, never our resilience. For my mother's sake, for my grandmother's sake, for my mother's sake. My ghost is grown, the seeds you've sown soon will be known. For my mother's sake, for my grandmother's sake, for my mother's sake, just stay away from me. My mother's sake, my mother's sake. Merci, Joe. Merci, Joe. It made me feel better. It might not make you feel better. I have something a little less heavy for you. I was blessed to be a part of a full circle production project called the Kayachtan Project. We were partnered with a Squamish elder, Bob Baker, who taught us about the territory, and we were able to go on a canoe excursion from Mosquito Creek, which is in North Vancouver, to Stanley Park, where we were able to do a ceremony, which we were told hasn't been a site for a ceremony like that in over 100 years. So it was a very, very special privilege and honor to be a part of that. And this is a song that I wrote. As it was an artist development program, we were actually paid almost a living wage to participate. This is Vancouver. They came as close as they could. And I wrote this song out of that experience, and it's about me trying to learn my language, and it has some of my language in it, and I do have a cheat sheet because I'm still learning, and yeah, I hope you enjoy it. It's called Coming Home. Yeah, this is what we hope for at the end of, or the middle of our journeys, or anytime you go through something traumatic or hard or horrible, we have hope for something better, for something more beautiful on the horizon. Don't lock me in. I'm not your kin. Send me back to the sea. My family waits for me, and I call for them in a language not my own. Oh, I call for them in a language not my own. Hold fast, battles down. My strength, not my own. Ancestors, hear my plea. Keep watch over me. And I spend my days with my ears open. Oh, my mother, her tongue, well, she does beckon. And sometimes in my dreams, I can almost hear it. And always when I sing, I can almost feel it. Feels like coming home. Feels like I'm coming coming home. Feels like coming home. Feels like coming back to a place my soul already knows. Feels like coming home. Eyes up, look around. My cousins, hold your ground. I do teasing the stay a while and see. Now power is found in the places that we are. Our spirits soar with every word that we relearn. And sometimes in my dreams I can almost hear it. And always when I sing, I can almost feel it. Yeah, it feels like coming home. Yeah, oh, it feels like coming home. Feels like I'm coming home. Feels like I'm coming back to a place my soul already knows. Feels like coming home. Merci, Charles.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much. And thank you to the Talking Stick Festival for making this happen. If you didn't know, tomorrow is the festival's gala. And that's happening at SFU Woodwards tomorrow at 7:30. I believe there's still tickets available. So if you want to go to the Talking Stick Festival gala, that's happening tomorrow, 7:30 p.m. So now I'm going to introduce tonight's speakers. Michelle Good is a writer of Cree ancestry and a member of the Red Pheasant Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. Her novel, Five Little Indians, was nominated for many awards, including the Giller, and won many awards, including the Governor General's Award for Fiction. Five Little Indians was also chosen for Canada Reads 2022, and as you all may know, Michelle Good's poems, short stories, and essays have been published in numerous magazines and anthologies across Canada. It's an honor to have you here. And then Andrea Crossan, yes, someone said it. Andrea Crossan is a member of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. She's an award-winning radio journalist with over 30 years of experience, reporting from over a dozen countries, including Afghanistan, Pakistan, Ukraine, South Africa, Uganda, and Brazil. And she's currently yes, wow, someone said that. She is currently the executive editor of the Global Reporting Center, an independent news organization based out of UBC. So what they're going to do is they're going to chat for about 45 minutes, and then they're going to take questions from the audience. So on that note, I want to let you know that we're not auditioning for speakers for next season. Which means please ask a question. We've done some surveys, and it turns out that 0% of respondents like rambling comments. 0. Anyway, on that note, Andrea and Michelle, please take the stage.
Okay. Hey, everyone. Oh, my goodness.
Wasn't feeling nervous until I looked out on all your faces. There's a lot of people here.
Just don't look.
I won't. My conversation, it's just us. It's just us. So, first of all, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, and huge thanks to Cousin Les, and to also for Zofia. Zofia Rose, amazing performance. So thank you to everybody. But let's get started because, oh my goodness, I have a million questions. We're probably going to get through about 500,000 of them tonight. So, or three. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about, for those of you who have come tonight and are looking forward to getting a signed copy, oh my goodness, you will be sitting down, and I hope you just make sure you give yourself enough time to read it in one sitting, because it is a compelling read. Truth-telling, 7 conversations about Indigenous life in Canada. I was saying, we were talking a little earlier, and I just said how you talk about how this is an invitation in terms of this conversation and not a confrontation that you're having, like this, that these collections of essays. But there's also a sense of urgency about it. Like, this is a conversation that we need to be having like ASAP. Is that fair? Because it feels like you just sort of had a moment of epiphany and you're like, I got to stop everything and write this book.
Sort of, yeah. Excuse me, I just came from Ontario, where standing outside is like smoking a pack of Export A's, right? It's like rough. So I sound like I've been smoking cigars. I promise I haven't been. And I'm thank you all for being here to have this conversation tonight. It's important, and it's nice to see all these faces. It's great. So there was this book that I wrote called 5 Little Indians, and
people may have heard of that. It's amazing.
And, when I wrote it, it took 9 years to write, so let's say during the process of writing it, I really thought that it would be, if it ever saw the light of day, that it would be a niche book for a niche audience. I had absolutely no expectation that it was going to blow the roof off the building, so to speak, and it did. And as a result of that, I had many invitations and opportunities to speak with people. People would invite me to different events, and I would have the opportunity to talk about the reality of our children being taken and the challenges they face in terms of how do they make a life carrying this tremendous burden of psychological injury. And what was so amazing to me was how people were so willing to have these conversations. That's not been my experience generally. And I'd started another novel. No, I will not tell you what it's about. And
I tried.
She did try valiantly. And but I had to set it aside because I thought this is a moment. This is really a moment where people are prepared to have these conversations. And so I thought, okay, I wrote a book about one of the implements in the colonial toolkit. So now I'm going to write a little book about many of the other implements in the colonial toolkit, because, so much happened before they came for the children. And so that's what this little book does. It talks about all those other things that happened before they came for the kids. And invites people to engage. It's called Conversations for a reason. And it was Buffy St. Marie who said, I'm too old to remember, okay. She said, a lot of people come at politics with their fists raised, but you really have to see through it. You have to see through that in order to become effective. And to me, it's all about being effective. And nobody is listening, nobody is hearing if they're yelling at each other. And so what I wanted to do was approach this in a way that people would feel comfortable walking into a meaningful, truthful, terrifying conversation, but a conversation.
Capital T, truthful, I would say. I think that a big part of what this book delves into is, I think at times the gap between the virtue signaling
and the performative nature that reconciliation can look like. And I think I'm going to quote you for this in terms of your strongest words in this are directed towards the actions of the federal government and what you at one point refer to as quote unquote weasel words. And you
Did
write,
I say that?
You may have said that. This is a direct quote. And you write, I am continually sickened by the disparity between the words uttered and the actions not taken by various politicians touting reconciliation. Okay, so lay it out for us. Let's talk about those actions and let's talk about where that comes from when you're talking about that sort of frustration there.
Okay. Well, what it really comes down to is the limits of what a government can or cannot do. And what I'm trying to say with this book is let's get under the myth of Canadian history. We've been told a story, and Danielle Smith, we all know who she is, yes, do we? This UCP person in Alberta. She was really clearly wrong in the way that she articulated the history, how the settlers came and the Indigenous people and they all joined together and they made Canada, and that it was this joint and cooperative and consensual arrangement that happened. And of course, it couldn't be anything but the truth. So what we have is a colonial foundation. We have the foundation to every social institution in this country is based in colonial values. And so they, without, are we getting feedback or is it just me? Yeah.
Should we be a little further away or?
Maybe.
Closer. Okay, all right. Is that better? And then maybe if you get a little closer on your side and then we won't. Is that better, Candy? Closer and directly into it. Oh my goodness, I'm a radio person. I'm embarrassed. I didn't even do this right. Oh, the worst.
Now, where was I? I know. Anyway, so virtually every institution that we have in this country is founded on colonial values. And so without achieving substantive change to what is at the foundation of those institutions, they can only go so far. And the essay that I have in here called Lucy and the Football, okay, I thought maybe I'm really old and people won't know about Lucy and the Football, right? But how many people know about Lucy and the Football? Okay, right, where Lucy's going, come on, Charlie Brown, right? And she's going to hold the football, right? She's going to hold that and Charlie Brown will be able to kick it. And once again, she pulls away the football. And that's what we see, that dynamic in relations between Indigenous people and the powers that be, if you will. Yes, we support self-determination. Yes, we support sovereignty. Yes, we support all of these things until it gets right down to making meaningful change, at which point they pull out the football once again.
And that part of it, of the pulling away of the football, so with that in mind, what do you imagine as being the action that takes place? Because you talk about how the process doesn't stop at a change of attitude. And so what does real change look like then?
I think in one of these essays I talk about how reconciliation has to be more than words. And, I don't mean to disrespect anybody because I started working with Indigenous organizations when I was 18 years old, and that was in 1994, right? And but back then, in the 70s, I confess, I would have never in my life imagined somebody standing up and saying, we acknowledge that this is the territory of the Musqueam, the Cree, the Haisla, whoever, right? Never would I ever thought that. And so I don't want people to think that I think that there's been no progress, because there certainly has been. But it's all limited because we don't get to that foundational change. And for me, it comes down to the land, ultimately. I mean, there's all sorts of things. But without land, without recognition of our relationship with the land, and it's not ownership as we would think in the terms of fee simple, but our relationship with the land as a part of the land and as being responsible for the land. Without substantial recognition of that, it'll never change. This will never change. And it comes down to Crown land and the notion of Crown land. As some of you know, I practiced law for a while. And one of the things that is considered anathema to democracy is if a law is arbitrary. So if I went to a courtroom and there was a law about employment or fishing or whatever, and I was able to demonstrate that that law was arbitrary and was just sort of whimsical in its creation, that law would be overturned. So let's take a look at Crown land. All right, how many people know how Crown land came to be? Yeah. So there was this king in the 1100s in England who said that only the king can own land. Basically as whimsical as waking up one day and saying only the king can own land. And that notion of the divine right, of the right of the king to own land and nobody else owns land, is what is at the foundation of the principle of Crown land. That's what we inherited by absorbing British law into Canadian law. And we see this where the Supreme Court of Canada made, a very significant decision in the Delgamuukw case where they recognized that the Wet'suwet'en people had not surrendered their sovereign right to land, that land had never been surrendered, no treaty, no anything that said, yes, we give it to you, all right, or we give it up. So technically, legally, that is theirs to do with as they wish. That is theirs to exclude who they wish, to include who they wish. That's theirs. So why is it that the RCMP are brutalizing the Wet'suwet'en? Why is that happening? And it's happening because of the principle, the concept of Crown land. Aboriginal title, and I call it Aboriginal because that's how it's recognized in the Constitution, is considered a burden on Crown title. So that's the equivalent of a lien on your house, okay, writ large. So even when the highest court of the land said you never surrendered your relationship with the land, your position on the land, your ownership of the land, I use that in terms of how those people perceived ownership. But still, because of that very arbitrary law of only the king can own land, it is a burden on Crown title. The Crown can go in and do whatever it pleases. And how can there ever be a fulsome recognition of Aboriginal title if the highest court of the land cannot rule? Okay, the highest court of the land takes the highest law of the land, the Constitution, says you never surrendered your land, but because of that underlying title, it doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that. It means you didn't surrender your land and you can do whatever you want until we want it. And that is what has to change.
Talking about Delgamuukw and the acknowledgement of oral history and the importance of that acknowledgement. In some of your essays, you delve into the oral history of non-Indigenous Canadians and talking a little bit more about how that is, the importance of that and what impact that oral history has had for non-Indigenous Canadians.
And for Indigenous Canadians.
Yes, and the impact on
them. Call them Canadians. That's in an essay that I wrote called Racism. What is it called?
Racism Sown?
Or Racism Perfectly Sown or something like that. I did write it, I swear.
Everyone talk amongst yourselves for a second.
That's right.
Racism carefully sown.
Carefully. Racism carefully sown. And I start this by a conversation about my non-Indigenous grandmother who when my father, in I think it was 1950, said that he was going to marry my Cree mum, she lost her mind, basically. She said he would be disinherited, that this was going to be the end of the world because, it would be even worse than having Indian kids. They'd be dirty half-breed kids. And so I raised the question, was my grandmother a monster? And the answer to that is no. She wasn't a monster. She was a prairie woman of her day. And I fully believe that racism is a learned behavior. And I think about going back to the Fathers of Confederation, going back even further than that, to the active players in the fur trade industry, and how there were certain things they used to do. They would kidnap Indigenous women and hold them hostage until their men agreed to trap for profit. And so they began to consider Indigenous women as chattel, okay? But what I think about of those awful people, that, said things like Sir John A. Macdonald, who said, the schools must not be in the communities because they will still have access to their parents, and they may learn, they're savages, they may learn to read and write, but they'll just be savages who learn to read and write. So we need to take them far, far away so that they can, have no connection with their community. And so I think about, did Sir John A. Macdonald have children? And what did they hear at his knee, okay? Did Hayter Reid, the architect of the residential school system, did he have kids? What did they hear? And what did they then pass on and on and on? And I taught a history course at UBC some years ago, and it was, I kind of laughed because it was a year-long course, and it was called The History of Indigenous People in Canada. And I said, only a year? But I thought about, how am I going to do this? Because, it was predominantly non-Indigenous students in the class. I had 2 Indigenous students and 2 Japanese students. How am I going to do this? So I asked them, first day, I said, okay, I want all of you to just engage in a conversation. Tell me what you know about Indigenous people. Everybody got just so uncomfortable. It's okay, it's all safe here, don't worry, just, say what you know. We need to know what you know. And so they eased in, and they got enthusiastic, and before you knew it, all of the stereotypes were flying around that room like, dandelions after they've gone to seed, right? And it was all the stereotypes, predisposition to alcoholism, they get free houses, they don't pay taxes, blah, 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 all the stuff. And my poor Indigenous students were like, really not having a good time. And so I just let it go, and then as it eased, naturally stopped, I then asked them, okay, now how do you know these things? And to their credit, they were stunned, absolutely stunned, because they couldn't say. They couldn't say how they'd come to know these things, and they tried to parse it out, they tried to figure it out, and it invariably came down to something they'd heard from family, okay? My mom said, my grandpa said, my great-grandmother, she knew, she saw, she did, she whatever. And it invariably came down to this method of conveying information through the generations that resulted in my grandmother, okay, in the 1950s, fully believing that we were awful, awful, disgusting, less than human things. And the power of that is that that racism is woven into the fabric of our, the social fabric of our country, just as much as the words to O Canada, just as much as anything, that racism is there, is a foundational thing. So we need to tell a different story, and that's why we need to have these conversations.
Now, may I follow up with, how did the relationship with your grandmother and your mother evolve over time? as what happens when we actually get to know each other as human beings?
Well, we'll start with how it started, okay? When it was, and you know my mom, you've met my mom. When it was just established that they were going to get married no matter what, my grandmother, after some time had passed and my mother was expecting her first child, my oldest sister. And so my grandmother invited her to tea with her lady friends and her white lady friends and said, "This is Martha. She's having puppies." So that would have been in 1951, not 1851. Okay. So then, my mother being my mother, she was non-reactive, and my mother raised us, and she maintained a relationship, and probably a closer relationship with my grandmother than my dad did. And as it turned out, my mother ended up caring for my grandmother in the last years of her life. And my grandmother chose my mother over her own children to, take care of her legal issues and so on and so forth. But that was because of who my mother was. And, my mother had a deep sense of the importance of gentle education. And she never lashed out at her. She just tolerated her and was her good self in spite of everything. And, and ultimately it came to a good thing, but I guess that's something we need to do writ large. But yeah, so if if anybody thinks, that this country was based on anything other than hatred and a desire to destroy us, they're just wrong.
There is an essay that you've included that really speaks to a very personal, important part of your life. The chapter is called $13.69. Talk a little bit about what that dollar amount means and what that symbolizes in your life.
Like so many Indigenous kids, I was taken into care when I was 13 years old. And I was in care for 5 years, part of the 60 Scoop, although my circumstance was different. Well, I don't know that it was that different, but I always imagined 60 Scoop as, taking babies and little kids, but they got me when I was older. And I was eligible for the 60 Scoop compensation, and just because I have this strange mind, I prorated it down to a per diem. And that's what my compensation was. It was $13.69 per day that I was in foster care. And I think about, if you read the essay, I do the math, right? Little kids that were taken as babies and were in care for 10 years or longer, and little kids that were taken and were adopted out and, basically spent their whole life in care. And it comes down to pennies per day. And the point isn't to say, give us more money, this isn't enough. The point of it is to say that monetary compensation is the only way that the Canadian legal system can compensate for harm that's been done. They don't make things right. They don't have a system for restoring honor or for acknowledging meaningfully what they've done. It's all about money. It's like you go to, you have a car accident, you go to court, and give you some money, right? That's the way it's done in this system. And so I wanted to talk about my own circumstance, not because I, had any desire to put that out in the world, but to put something, to approach the question of the scoop and compensation and the scope of the scoop, if you will, by my own personal experience. I feel that if you can personalize these stories, and you can look at me and say, oh my God, she went through that, then it's easier for you to understand the much larger situation. And that essay leads into a discussion of the Adopt Indian and Métis program. I find it quite ironic that this provincial system in Saskatchewan has the same acronym as the American Indian Movement. Adopt Indian and Métis. I laugh, but it's hideous. But, that's what we do, right? It's hideous and we laugh, right? And then we live to fight another day. But the Adopt Indian Métis program is addressed in here. And there's a wonderful book that's come out by a woman named Ali Stevenson that is a detailed analysis of all of that. But 1974, okay, not 64, 54, 34, 1974, the ministry, the Social Services Ministry in Saskatchewan, the director, wrote a letter to a social worker telling her that she was being made the salesperson of the month because she had apprehended more Indigenous kids than anyone, okay? It's in here. The actual letter is in here, okay? They used to take these little babies and they would take their photographs and put them in the newspaper, like they were, a patio set for sale or a puppy. And, this is Gwen. She may look she's a little, standoffish with strangers. I wonder why. The last stranger was the one that took her from her mother. But they were just like these pages and pages in the newspaper with these little kids up for sale, really, for adoption, but for sale. And, and in that letter to the salesperson of the year, I don't think I can say it verbatim, but there was, it ended off with a comment about, continue doing your great work, and it was about sufficiency, about assessing the sufficiency of the homes of these kids that they were being taken from. And I thought, well, who the hell is he to determine the sufficiency of an Indigenous home? And I use an example. This came up in the 70s when I was working with a provincial Indigenous organization here in Vancouver. And there was in the Northeast and the Treaty 8 territory east of the Rockies, but still in British Columbia, there was a case of an apprehension where children were taken because the social worker said there wasn't enough food in the house and the kids were going hungry. This was a family that was living a semi-traditional lifestyle. They were living on their trap line, and hanging from the rafters were hundreds and hundreds of pounds of dried moose meat and deer meat. But when this was put to the social worker, she said, "Oh, I thought they were rags." Okay, so, and I use that example to say, so these are the people that are empowered to make decisions about the sufficiency of a home, and they know nothing. This wealth of food that was in the home, and she took the kids because there was no food, because she didn't understand, because she was just alien.
And she was rewarded for it.
Oh, well, they are, yeah.
There's an absurdity to my next question, so I'm going to embarrass. I'm
Good,
going
we
to
could use a little
apologize.
absurdity.
Yeah, I'm going to apologize in advance because I'm going to talk on the other side of that part of it. You talk about how we are in the age of apology, and how at the end of last century and throughout this 21st century that we're in this moment. What value, and I'll put in brackets, if any, is there in your eyes of these apologies, whether they be from the church, whether they be from governments?
Well, I know that I remember when Stephen Harper was finally forced to issue an apology. And when I say forced, I mean forced, because the settlement agreement for the residential school settlement could not be finalized unless he apologized. So if there was ever an example of weasel words. And but he did. And I know, I don't, well, I do. I know that those apologies mean a lot to people, because at least it's something, and people can believe that they're sincere and that they mean something. I don't really think they are. I think that they're a means to an end, right? I mean, for example, the papal apology. He, even when the Pope came here and issued his apology, it was still not on behalf of the Roman Catholic Church. It was on behalf of some individual people, some bad actors, which is absurd. Speaking of absurd, everybody knows, okay, what went on, and everybody knows that these abusers were simply moved to another parish when they were caught out, or whatever. And so did not apologize on behalf of the church, which is really what would have been a meaningful apology, a mea culpa, an indication that, yes, it was horrible and wrong, and we did it. That is what's necessary. And, and also no reference to genocide. He did later, after he left the country, he said something about genocide, but not to those people that gathered there to hear some truth and got more weasel words. And it's because the status quo must continue in the minds of the powers that be. And so, it's kind of like saying anything to get us, just a little bit further on. And, and then, speaking of genocide, I used to think that, the residential schools and foster care and those kinds of things were directed towards assimilation and termination in that way, but that. And then a friend of mine said to me some years ago, well, if that was the case, why wasn't there anything for these kids when they came out of res school? Why were they just punted once the support check stopped coming to the school for them? And I had to really give that thought. I mean, this was a long, long time ago. But if you look at the definition of genocide, it applies to our people. There's five factors that are things that can be considered genocide. One of them is the removal of children from one group to another. Check. One of them is to create conditions that will contribute to the harm or death of people. Check. You can go through all 5 of those definitions, and they apply. They apply in this case. And I think of these things a lot in the context of the prairies, because that's where my people are from. And, I mentioned briefly Sir John A. Macdonald and his policy of submission through starvation, and his intentional withholding of rations. He first of all promoted the decimation of the herds of bison, and for us that was food, clothing, and shelter. It was that, but it was also brucellosis being passed from cattle to the bison herds, and they were completely decimated. And so it created a condition of starvation already. And then there were 2 stages to treaty making in the prairies. One was that you signed the treaty. The other was that you chose a reserve. My great-grandmother's uncle was Mistahi Muskwa, Chief Big Bear, and he held out longer than anybody, wouldn't take treaty, and said that he wouldn't choose a reserve because he saw it as a noose around the neck of his people. And so they were up at Frog Lake trying to get through another awful winter, and the Indian agent would say to them, because he had taken treaty but hadn't chosen a reserve at that point in 1882, and so the Indian agent would say, yeah, come and, you can come to the storage house, we'll give you your rations. They would go, he'd say, no, come tomorrow. So they'd go tomorrow, he'd say, no, come tomorrow. And so they'd go, no, come tomorrow, and he'd laugh at them. And so, these were prairie horseman warriors that, my great-grandmother was born in 1856. She never saw a non-Indigenous person until she was 20. So place that in the context of that history. And so they rose up, they killed him. They killed the Indian agent, they killed a couple of other people. They took a few people hostage, and then the Canadian militia, also known as the Northwest Mounted Police, was dispatched to kill them, and they didn't. But when I was doing research for the new novel that I'm not talking about, I came across this thing, and I have to start with Ernest Hemingway, and it'll hopefully make sense when we get through it. Ernest Hemingway is credited with writing the shortest short story in the world, and it goes like this: baby shoes for sale, never worn. Now, there's a whole story in there, a whole complete story. I found an equivalent story in my research. And it was, oh my God, I'm so glad I don't smoke. Can you imagine what this would be like? So it was an ad, a classified ad, in a newspaper in the North Battleford area. That's where my family is from. And it was classified in the found section. And it goes like this: found, white horse, in the place where the Indians starved to death. There's my shortest short story. And the whole story that's in there, think about it. Okay, here's a guy, he finds a white horse, and he, it's like saying, across the street at the 7-Eleven, right? The place where the Indians starved to death was a place that everybody was familiar with. And, that wasn't the shocking thing about, it's like, here's this horse, somebody's got to own this horse. That was the key aspect of the story, not that was the place where the Indians starved to death. And so when we think that there wasn't a genocide in this country, we're wrong.
You also talk about yourself and refer to yourself as having deep idealism. So
I'm a fool.
I know. Well, I guess my question is, it's kind of the knowing what you know, knowing what we understand to be true, that you have that your sense of hope remains intact.
What option is there? What option is there? And, I think I got that from my mom. My mother, in the face of real, years in residential school, years in a TB sanatorium, the things that she went through, and she never stopped being a hopeful, gracious person. And, but if you want to be useful in the world, you can't be without hope. You have to believe that the things that you visualize as necessary are possible. If you think of them as necessary but don't think of them as possible, how can you possibly be effective?
Well, I'd like to follow up, as we have a room full of people who are clearly very engaged in your writing and about the importance of Indigenous literature. And you actually dedicate one of the essays, one of your chapters is dedicated to what you sort of outline a 50-year trajectory of Indigenous literature. You write, in every genre, Indigenous writers are at the vanguard of injecting our truth into the world. And you write about how this is modifying the Canadian fairy tale of its colonial history. So as an author, do you think about the non-Indigenous person sitting down with this book? Oh, am I somebody's alarm? About somebody like, so for folks who are sitting in this room today, what do you hope that they're going to get out of this in terms of their understanding?
Well, that they've been bamboozled, right?
Yes.
Yes. They've been enlisted in the project of Canadian colonialism without their knowledge and consent. How do you like it? Right? Sorry. Oh, me. You know, and I mean, I laugh, but what else can we do, right? And laughing is good for all of us. But, you know, I get hundreds of emails from readers, and it astonishes me. And these are people that are saying things to me like, I just didn't know, but now I'll never forget. Okay? They're saying things to me like, I've treated Indigenous people terribly all my life because I believed something, and thank you for showing me something different. Thank you for making me a better person. So yes, right, literature has the capacity to make fundamental change if people are willing to take it in. And, you know, the thing with Indigenous literature is the same thing as the Constitution. People often say and question, what can we do? And, you know, first of all, you can take responsibility for your own education. We're busy doing other things. But I often think about, we changed the Constitution, okay? We were about 4% of the population at the time in the early 80s, when virtually everybody that I was working with in Indigenous organizations were, excuse me, direct survivors of residential school, dealing with all of those, you know, the tremendous burden of psychological industry, yeah. And we changed the Constitution, which is almost impossible to do. Ask Quebec, right? I mean, and we did that. And it's the same thing with literature. The doors weren't just sort of, you know, thrown open. If I'd written Five Little Indians in 1990, it would have never seen the light of day. And, you know, and it wasn't, you know, it was, there's a group of Indigenous writers from the 70s on to the 90s that many of them gave up their own writing careers to establish a publishing reality. We had Thetis Books, all Indigenous owned, Pemican Books, all Indigenous owned, Kagadon's Press, Indigenous owned, and we did that. Nobody said, here, let's, you know, give you some dough and you can do that. We did it. And it follows, if you look at it carefully enough, it's quite interesting because the growth of an Indigenous literary canon follows the trajectory of Indigenous resistance, and it's very interesting as well as entertaining, and you know, yeah.
Well, I have, as much as I could, again, go for another 3 or 4 pages of my huge list of questions, I'd like to take this time now to open this conversation up to the room and to, I know that we have a lot of people very curious about this book, about Five Little Indians. So I'm going to give us the opportunity now to ask if there's any questions that you may have for Michelle. Good. I see immediately hands. People, you've been hanging on to these for a while. Okay. Sir, if you'd like to stand up.
So is Tom?
Yeah.
Good evening, Ms. Good. My name's Bob. I'm a citizen of the Fisher River Cree Nation.
Hi.
Sarah Carter, I'm fascinated with her book, Lost Harvest. That was published 30 years ago. I still read it all the time. What do you think about that book?
I haven't read it. I haven't read every book that's been written. But I suspect that it's really good. What do you think of it, and why?
In your book, the tenor, don't pull any punches. Tell it like it is. And Sarah Carter did that when she looked at agriculture, when that time in the 1870s, where many Indigenous people were saying, we can make a change.
Mm-hmm.
We need some help, we can do it. But like you say in your book, time and again, Ottawa said,
Mm-hmm.
no way are you going to succeed.
Yeah. Well, where I will go with that is, and I'm sure you're very aware of it, is the peasant farming policy. Okay, the peasant farming policy was, part of the treaty was that the government would provide Indigenous people with the necessary implements to, I guess, move into an agrarian lifestyle. But of course, what was promised in the treaty was not what was ultimately given. And there was like one plow for 10 families and so on. That was bad enough. The settler farmers became irate about Indigenous people being provided with one plow for 10 families because they felt that it was unfair. And this goes into the whole compensation thing, okay, where they saw it as charity. They saw it as giving them an unfair advantage. They didn't see it as, part of the terms of an international agreement, okay? So there was a hue and cry, and just as, the federal government tends to respond to those things in this day and age, they established this peasant farming policy. And what that was is that Indigenous farmers were not permitted to use any mechanized farming equipment. They had to use scythes for harvest. They weren't permitted to plant wheat. They could plant other grains, but not wheat and wood vegetables. If any of their equipment broke, they had to repair it themselves. And, basically, created an atmosphere of failure. My grandfather was a prairie farmer and did damn well anyway. And that's, what we see is that in spite of it, how much more it might have been had those impediments not been put in our way.
With those opportunities as opposed to everything that gets pulled back.
Yeah.
There's a question, I think, over here. Oh,
Michelle, sad that you've left Kamloops, but glad you got home. I think it's one of the first essays in your book, you talk about how you don't phrase it this way, but the economic theory of the Indigenous peoples, which was quite well developed, I'm talking now in the 16 and 1700s, was a subsistence theory, whereas the Hudson Bay Company people were a profit theory, and that affected...
He's a lawyer.
really?
Could you just expand on that a bit? I can see, for example, that a subsistence theory might actually be what we need to save the planet, as opposed to profit.
Big surprise. Well, it really gets down to that, is the harm that capitalism has done. And we're seeing it now. I'm getting old. I'm 66. I'm going to be 67 this year. And I look at the difference between what the economy was like when I was a young person and what it's like now, and how we have moved so much closer to pure raw capitalism, where everything is weighed, measured, and priced. That's value now in the world that we're living in. And that was never value. That was never how value was defined by Indigenous people. And I think you're right. I'm right. that to, constant, perpetual exploitation. And, if you look at the political ideology of capitalism, it's founded on the necessity of exploitation. You exploit the resource for the purpose of profit. And so where does that stop? Where does that end? Look, our entire country is on fire. Where does it end? Yeah.
question.
Hello, Michelle.
Hi.
Of the characters in your book, is there one in particular that struck your heart?
Oh, man. Of the 5, right? And 5 Little Indians?
5 Little Indians, yeah.
Yeah. Not really, and I'll tell you why. It took me 9 years to write that book for a number of reasons, but primarily because it's a subject matter where people could be hurt, and you can't take that lightly. But because it was that long, those kids became like my kids, and as any good mother will tell you, they don't have favorites. So, but I think the one character, it's not a primary character, the one character that touches my heart the most is Lily. And that's because Lily is the only factual character in the book. Lily was my mother's friend in residential school, and she hemorrhaged to death from tuberculosis on the playground. She must have been about 7 or 8 years old at the time. And just imagine that, just imagine that. Just, what it means to hemorrhage from tuberculosis. It means that you're suffocating on your own blood. And when we hear residential school denialists talking about, oh yeah, show me the bodies, I'll believe it then. My hero, Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, who was the medical officer for the Department of Indian Affairs in the early 1900s, and the Duncan Campbell Scott, Superintendent of Indian Affairs at the time. He was getting all kinds of flack from Indigenous parents because kids were dying and not coming home, and nobody would know where they were. And so he sent off Dr. Bryce to do a condition study of the residential schools. Dr. Bryce came back and said, if we had set out to create an effective mechanism for the effective transference of tuberculosis, we've done it with the residential schools. For his trouble, he was fired because he was pressing for change. Duncan Campbell Scott said, while it's true that the children die in their villages or die in the schools at a much faster rate than they do in their villages, that in itself is not enough to change our plan. Our objective is to achieve a final solution. Okay, whoever thought final solution didn't stem from Nazi Germany? Okay, a final solution where there will be not one Indian who has not been absorbed into the body politic. He later wrote an essay where he said, it's too bad that the kids didn't benefit from the education at the schools, because in some schools up to 50% of the children died. So the next time somebody says or tries to say to you, kids didn't die there, people don't have to believe me. You can go to your own government records and it's all there.
And as you point out in truth-telling, that the notion that's been perpetuated over and over again that residential school was good intentions run amok.
Yeah, yeah. We have senators and politicians. Our prime minister, hopeful, is one of them.
I'll take one last question. I see the back row. Hi.
Brandon, it's so nice to hear you speak. You said in your talk that it comes down to land, and then you explained how the concept of crown land, how that will be potentially oppressive. And I was curious if you had any thoughts on how people like myself who have grown up here and are looking to purchase land and perhaps rural land with friends, like larger plots of land. Do you think there's a possibility to add or to help with the reconciliation of landowners?
I don't quite know. I've said that reconciliation is not going to happen in the House of Commons or in Government House. It's going to happen across the backyard fence. It isn't elected people that are going to ultimately make change. It's your neighbor, and it's your willingness to work together. And there are people doing interesting things. Like I'm aware of several instances where people that are coming into the last act are leaving their land to Indigenous communities, with with the intention of it being protected forever as Indigenous land. And I think that there are as many options as we are creative. And we can be as creative as, well, we can be very creative if we choose to be, and collaborative and helpful to each other, I think.
That sounds like a very, that's the best note we could possibly end on this evening. So I want to just take a moment. I'll start by thanking, obviously we really appreciate Les George, who's the storyteller in residence here at the Vancouver Public Library. We want to thank Zofia Rose for her beautiful performance this evening, powerful, and set us up for this conversation in the best possible way. And most of all, I want to just take a moment to appreciate and thank Michelle Good. Your work is powerful, it has meaning, it has resonance. What you read in this book, you cannot unknow it. So I say that you take it, you read it, and you cannot unknow it, and you take that and you think about how you go through this world, the conversations you have, the relations you have. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming out tonight at the Vancouver Public Library. Appreciate it. Please take time to go to the corner and get a signed copy of the book. It's powerful reading. It is a one-sitting reading, and I appreciate all your time and your thought. Michelle Good.
Thank you. Thank you. Sit down.